I'm going to do something very difficult, and that is to squeeze my 15-week course into about 45 minutes. All right? So we'll be galloping along. And I want to emphasize here the context in which Rivera, in a sense, like his generation, lived through. Because it was a period of time, if you stop and think about it, and I'll go through this in more detail, from about the 1890s through the 1920s, was really an incredible turn in global history into which this revolution called the Mexican Revolution is inserted. In that sense, this incredible period of time has so many currents to it, so many cross currents, that it's not surprising that people like Rivera, like Orozco, like Siqueiros, like Gallo, and we go down the list here of intellectuals and artists, had to negotiate and contend with all of these currents, all of these riptides in a sense that were taking place politically, economically, socially, culturally, ideologically, and so on, in this very short period of time. And if you look carefully at the careers of the leading intellectuals, artists, and so on of this period of time, it's like trying to follow a bullet ricocheting off walls, because they were being hit by all of these elements, in a sense, all at the same time, kind of like an atom is hit with rays and so on, and that atom explodes, etc. Right? And in that respect, I want us to appreciate those contextual elements that are often minimized when we look at the drama, in a sense, of this man called Diego Rivera and all of the dramas that he generated. Dramas that were political, dramas that were economic in the sense of this whole debate about him receiving commissions from a government, from capitalists, and so on. The debate ideologically, the famous scene, which I assume one of my counterparts will undoubtedly recount to you, right, where he goes to a meeting of the Communist Party and goes with a 6-gun, and so does Siqueiros, and they're going to have the OK Corral shootout, and so forth and so on, right? The social drama that he generated, in the sense that he and others created this incredible social circle in and around Mexico City that sent out rays, in a sense, to all different parts of the world. But a social circle that was like a gravitational pull that attracted and drew people from all over the world to come to Mexico City, whether it was D.H. Lawrence or whether it was the leader Raúl de la Torre from Peru, and Tina Modotti and Weston and artists from other parts of the world, people involved in the Pan-African anti-colonial movement that started to take off at the turn of the century, and so forth and so on. So there was incredible social drama, not to mention what is the theme today, and that is the cultural drama that this man and his artistic counterparts generated in this period of time. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this period of time, and I want to go through very quickly that stuff, if you will, that pushed and shoved and cajoled, etc. Rivera and others to look at the world differently. And if you follow his Cubist period and so on all the way through the 1930s, you see him, what seems to be a meandering, but is in fact an artist, like intellectuals, philosophers, and so on at that time, who had to, in a sense, respond to, confront, and deal with all of these currents that were taking place in this period of time. So with that as a kind of introduction, allow me to very quickly hit on the following points. The first is, the Mexican Revolution was really not one revolution. It was a series of social movements. And each of these social movements had contrasting and oftentimes conflicting goals in terms of what the revolution meant. Not only politically, in terms of organizing Mexico and its political structure, not only economically, in terms of reorganizing the economy away from the model that existed before. The fancy academic term is export model development. All right? And to what extent this new economy was going to follow the new ideas being generated, for example, from the Soviet Union, new ideas that were germinating in the United States, new ideas germinating from what was taking place in places like China and Japan and the like. It also had to think about how to reconstitute Mexican society, how to reorganize the social relationships after this long period that took the lives of at least 1 million Mexicans, another million casualties and so on, not to mention the hundreds of thousands that left Mexico in this period of time, particularly to the United States. So how is Mexico going to rethink its society? And of course, culturally, this incredible cultural project that the Mexican Revolution generated as a consequence of this period of time. In that respect, we tend to often think of the Mexican Revolution in terms of its icons. But we need to also understand that these iconic figures were often in conflict with each other. Let us start with probably the most enduring person associated with the revolution, and that is Emiliano Zapata. In the ideological context, particularly in the midst of the debate over the meaning of the Bolshevik Revolution, Zapata was a reactionary. He wanted to go back in time. He wanted to go back to a period of time in which Mexico was fundamentally agrarian, organized around small villages and communities, based on a notion of culture that emphasized tradition and the continuity of those traditions, including, for example, the relationships between men and women. Zapata was no great feminist in that respect. Keep in mind, this is a period of time of the acceleration of the feminist movement. And I suspect that if Emiliano Zapata had become the president of Mexico, one of the first issues he would have to contend with would be suffrage for women, women and their rights in marriage, women and their rights in divorce, women and their rights in property, and the like. Undoubtedly, it would have caused a headache for Mr. Zapata in that respect. So in that ideological context, to idealize el campo, to idealize the countryside, undoubtedly would have raised all kinds of debates and discussions, not the least of which would have been the role of women in this allegedly revolutionary Mexican society. Now let's go to Pancho Villa, another icon. If there's a ricochet bullet in the history of the Mexican Revolution, it is Pancho Villa. He started not knowing what the hell he intended to do as a revolutionary. He knew what he did like, but he was very unclear about what he intended to do in that respect. This is among the reasons why he changed his sides, all during the revolution, including his attitude toward the United States. At one point, very anti-US. At another time, because the United States was fundamental to his ability to acquire arms and ammunition, that Villa often cooperated with the United States. Look the other way, for example, in 1914, when the US military forces occupied the port of Veracruz. Villa was reluctant to criticize the United States, because by criticizing the United States in 1914, conceivably they would have cut off his source of arms and ammunition, which, by the way, the U.S. did subsequently when it turned against Villa in 1916 and 1917. And in that regard, both Zapata and Villa needed people to codify, eventually, what they wanted from the revolution. In that respect, both men had intellectuals that essentially gave expression in written form to those oftentimes unclear ideas that emanated from their involvement in what became known as the Mexican Revolution in that respect. So you can imagine an artist then trying to think about ways of putting Zapata in a painting, especially an artist who was allegedly a socialist or a communist. How to make Zapata relevant to the revolution was one of the challenges that all the artists who wanted to make him an icon, who wanted to put him in paintings, had to contend with. And again, for a lot of communists and socialists, Sabata was looking backward, not looking forward in that respect. The same thing with Villa. And if you will notice, there are very few paintings in that long history of Mexican muralism that make Villa the central character. A lot of them include Sabata, but not Villa. And I suspect my counterparts later in the day will discuss among the reasons why that may have been the case, right? Or in the Q&A, if you want, after my short intervention here. Now, let's talk about a couple of other iconic figures, because after the revolution is over, one of the major tasks facing the new order is how to tell the story of the revolution. Just like all of us as teachers at one point or another have to tell the story of American history or world history, whatever it is, which puts us in a position of being highly selective, right? The standards kind of recede, right? The book and so on is there before us, but we put more emphasis on one thing as opposed to another, and so forth and so on. And we almost always have to do that because there's not enough time really to do everything that we want to do. In that sense, the new order, after the violence subsides, roughly around 1917, 1920 and so on, how is it going to tell the story? How is it going to inculcate, if you will, a rationale, a justification for just what happened, in a manner of speaking? One way is to focus on the constitutional charter that came out of the revolution. And that is the Constitution of 1917. And I'm going to give Jean a handout and so on that she can run off and give it to you. But I would emphasize 3 of those constitutional articles as a challenge to telling the story of the revolution. One is the article on education. For its time, the Constitution of 1917 was considered the most radical in 1917. This is before the end of the Bolshevik Revolution and before the Communist Party is constituted and so on. So for its time, it was quote-unquote revolutionary. All education is free. Now, at one level, it seems innocuous. But keep in mind that going back to around roughly 1521, one institution dominated all schooling in Mexico, and that was Catholic Church. So all of a sudden, this new order says, no, the church, you're out of here. We are going to teach the children of the New Mexico. Well, in many respects, the largest and most complicated challenge is then what to put in its place. It's one thing to say the church is out of here, no more catechism, gospel, all these ideas about religion and so forth and so on. Now, we are going to write the curriculum. And then people look around, what the hell are we going to write? What are we going to emphasize? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who are the guys who started as good guys, ended up as bad guys, and so forth? How do we explain independence and the meaning of independence? How do we explain the loss of half of our territory, more or less, to the United States? How do we explain how this economy was basically controlled by foreigners by 1910? And how do we explain, how do we justify all of these new rules and ceremonies and rituals called Mexicanness and so on? Because in that first phrase of Article 3, one of the fundamental intents of education in Mexico now is to create a love of country. Well, what country are you going to love? And how do you create love in the classroom for your country? Now, we're jaded. Most of us went to the fireworks and so forth and so on, but very few of us took out the Constitution of the United States and looked at the glory, in a sense, generated by that moment in our own history and so on. Didn't sit down our children, our cousins, our nephews and nieces and talk to them for 30 minutes about the meaning of the July 4th and so on. All right? Rather, most of us ran to the store to get hot dogs, hamburgers, beer, whatever it was, not to mention organic bananas and so forth and so on. Okay? All right. And that's not a criticism. The important point, though, is that education under the revolution meant creating a sense of identification with this new order, or what Mexicans call developing a sense of Mexicanidad, a new sense of what it meant to be Mexican. The old order of Porfirio Diaz, going back to the 1870s, and he was a dictator and ruled Mexico until roughly 1910 or so. All of those ideas were out the door. And think about all those ideas that were so powerful at the end of the 19th century, that this new notion of education that said all Mexicans had the potential to reach the highest level of being a human being, and that's right there in Article 3 of the Constitution. Well, goes out the idea, for example, of social Darwinism. Here was a period of time in which in 1917, 1921, 1924, this country passed restrictive laws based on the notion that Southern and Eastern Europeans in particular were genetically, intellectually, culturally, and so on, inferior to Anglo-Saxons. And it totally changed the history of the immigration to this country as a consequence. Well, here comes the Mexican Revolution that basically says, phooey. That was in my class. Okay. Phooey, right, with this concept. This is a period where people believed that the shape of your skull indicated certain attributes or not. So that if we were to take this gentleman's skull, as you can see, he's trying to hide, right, this slope that he has at the backside of his head, right, by putting all his hair kind of like in the back. What does that indicate? Well, if you were a student of phrenology, which was a real science taught at the University of Wisconsin, at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Harvard, and Princeton, and Yale, and so on, that slope indicated that he was a terrible dancer. Are you a terrible dancer? Yes, he is. See, what did I say? Okay, all right. But the important point here is to understand that in the midst of these ideas, what the Mexican Revolution said is, for our purposes, for this new nation, these ideas have no validity. In that sense, then, education was about creating an identification with this new order that was political, that was economic, social, cultural, etc. And how to do that, given the fact that the Mexican government, federal government, had never taken on the task of educating virtually all of the Mexican population. For all intents and purposes, public education did not exist in Mexico in the late 19th century. A very, very thin crust of Mexicans even got an elementary education, much less a secondary or university education. And if they had a university education, they were just as likely to go to Paris or go to London to get that university of education, and some even sneaked over into Madrid. Por favor. Going back to the motherland, colonial motherland in a sense, to get their university education. But the important point here is to understand the meaning of public education being free and available to all Mexicans at a time where education was central to sustaining the stratification in that society at the end of the 19th century. Let's jump to another one. Article 123, which was the most advanced legislation for workers in the world at that time. Think about it. Article 123 argued that wages should be pegged to the cost of living, what we call a living wage, which is a controversial subject in the year 2010. So here's Mexicans in 1917 saying wages should allow people to live decently, to have access to basic necessities and the like. It argued for the 8-hour day in 1917. It argued protections for female workers in 1917. Outlawed child labor, etc. And we could go on and give other examples. The important point again is to understand then that the promise of a free education also had a class dimension. And that is that the parents of those children that were now going to go to Mexican schools should be people that have an opportunity for a decent life, if you will. The last one that I want to mention here, and it's a tough one. Tough one because it is so complicated. And that is Article 27, which basically said Mexico is for the Mexicans. What's on top of the land and what's underneath the land is the patrimony of the Mexican people. And we, the federal government, will be the stewards of that patrimony, whether it's on top or below the land. Well, you're talking nationalization, you're talking confiscation of property, you're talking about the government deciding the relationship between capital and the nation, and how to define that relationship, and so forth. Now, out of Article 27, a series of issues emanate. One, most obviously, is nationalism. But a nationalism that puts nation in front of profits, nation in front of private property, nation in front of a number of other economic ideas that at that time were completely accepted, particularly in the United States, where capital was king. Government should retreat and withdraw. No intervention of the government in the economy. We call it now neoliberalism, or we call it free market ideas, and so forth and so on. As all of us know, we have learned our lesson again about how those ideas can create all kinds of havoc. All right? So the Mexicans then were caught in a bind. Next door was at this time the most advanced capitalist country now, right, making its charge, because the Brits were basically receding as a world power and so on. The U.S. is basically, if you pardon the expression, kicking ass all over Latin America and so on, forcing the British to back down 3 times in a row between 1894 and 1896. We had disputes with Britain, and each time the Brits backed down. So clearly, by the end of the 1890s, the United States was top dog in the hemisphere for the first time. Keep in mind the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, was an empty letter. Because Latin America, or Mexico in particular, was invaded several times, all during the 19th century. And I do not recall in my history books the U.S. coming to the rescue of Mexico and taking on Spain and taking on France, etc., during that period of time. In fact, the U.S. did the opposite. They just kind of took half of Mexico in this period of time. So, in this respect, Article 27 then, and its meaning, was totally against the grain, ideologically, of this powerful neighbor next door, not to mention ideas elsewhere. In that sense, then, it also justified state monopolies. Why? Because the state, as steward of that patrimony, could decide the allocation of resources. So for roughly 70 years, Mexico had state-owned enterprises that monopolized a series of different economic activities, including the distribution of electricity, distribution of gas, distribution of water, and we could go on and give other examples. And only very recently, in the 1990s, were those monopolies dismantled in that regard. But for years and years and years, the Mexican government produced steel. For years and years and years, the Mexican government controlled newsprint, which basically meant controlling journalism in Mexico, etc. I could go on. The important point is this, is to understand that Article 27 then defined what was the welfare of the nation in such a way that the government would make those decisions, if you would. The last point about Article 27, and that is the notion that Mexico's resources would not be subject to foreign intervention. Now, a lot of it had to do with the role of foreign capital in Mexico prior to the revolution. But it went further. And this is the last point, and there's no one article in the Constitution that enunciates this point. And that is the issue of foreign policy and Mexico in the aftermath of the revolution. It was a highly nationalist constitution, and the sum of that constitution basically came down to the question of interventionism. Interventionism. In that sense, the Mexican government repudiated the whole notion that a foreign power could intervene in the internal affairs of any Latin American country, not to mention Mexico. And if you stop and think about it, there were a lot of reasons why that would be the case. Because all during the latter part of the 19th century, Africa was carved up in pieces by the great powers. Right? Even Belgium got a piece of Africa. All right? Portugal. I mean, these are tiny little pipsqueak powers at this time. And yet, if you look at an old map and you look at the Belgian Congo, that's a big piece of real estate, right? Many times over the size of Belgium, and so forth. This is a period of time in which the Brits and the French and the Japanese are trying to figure out who is going to carve up Asia in one way or another. The French take Indochina, the Brits expand in the South Asian continent through the Afghan War and so on. Japan is taking a piece of the peninsula there, we call it Korea. The Russians even are making noises in this period of time. So, and of course the open door policy, right? Because we want a little piece of the action too, and so on, the United States. So this is a period of time in which colonialism, imperialism, is once again raising in a very active way throughout the world in the latter part of the 19th century. Not to mention what the United States was doing in Latin America in this period of time, where it intervened more than 20 times between 1900 and the end of the 1920s in various parts of the Caribbean. Now we cover that up and call it the Roosevelt Corollary, which is a nice way of saying this is what we think we have the right to do in the hemisphere. And of course, by this time, there's no one challenging the United States by this period of time. The Brits had checked out. Germany was never a real presence in Latin America. The French had checked out. The Spaniards, of course, in 1898 just proved what everyone knew, is that they had basically no influence any longer in their former colonies and so on. So the United States was basically unchecked in this period of time. And think about the violation to Mexico's sovereignty in this period of time. The sovereignty that was violated going back to the Cananea strike of 1907, one of the sparks of the revolution, when Arizona Rangers, at the request of the owners of the mine, crossed the Mexican border in order to suppress the strikers in Cananea and the state of Chihuahua. Not to mention the fact that the United States would take over the major port of Mexico in 1914 for several months. Not to mention the Pershing expedition of 1916, 1917. And we could go and give other examples. And the colmo, the height of this, would be the Bucareli Agreements of 1923, where the U.S. government basically told at that time, the President of Mexico, Álvaro Obregón, we will not recognize you diplomatically. Now, why is that so important in 1923? Well, who in Europe had money to give to Mexico, to loan Mexico, and so on in this period of time? 1923. Britain was exhausted from World War I. Germany was in shambles. The French had already become a second-rate power, maybe even a third-rate power in that respect. Who else was available? The United States. So recognition from the United States was absolutely fundamental to the economic stability of this new economy that was trying to overcome all of the devastation that had occurred for roughly 10 years. So recognition from the United States was fundamental. And Álvaro Obregón caved in to U.S. pressures and signed off, basically saying that the revolution and its constitutional charter will only be implemented in those cases since 1917, leaving, in that respect, large numbers of foreign interests untouched by the Constitution. at that period of time. Later, this would be reversed. Important point is this, that these three articles establish the basis, in many respects, of the vision at that period of time as to what was the meaning of the Mexican Revolution, leaving it then, therefore, to José Vasconcelos, to Rivera, to Siqueiros, to Orozco, to novelists, to poets, to composers, and so on. What did that mean musically? If the waltz was not a good reflection of Mexicanismo, of Mexicanidad, then what kind of music would be the music of this new order? If the novels of the late 19th century were not consistent with the ideals of the revolution, then how would novels be written after 1917 in Mexico to be considered Mexican literature? Not to mention in painting and so forth and so on. All of this had to be debated. Now, what are some other things that are taking place? Not only the decline of Britain and European powers, not only the rise of the United States and Japan as world powers, but also other things. And again, in my short period of time here, I can only be suggestive. One is the tremendous power of this new thing called popular culture. Popular culture as reflected in radio. Keep in mind, commercial radio doesn't take off until the 1920s, which of course raises a question for Mexico. Who will control radio? The private sector or the Mexican government? BBC, take the case of Britain, or the private sector? And if it's going to be the private sector, to what extent, if any, will the content of radio be reflective of Mexico in this new order? This is a period of time of the rise of the phonographic business, which immediately raises a question in musical recordings. What kind of music is going to be recorded and played to be considered Mexican music? Now, this is a period of time where Monterrey, Nuevo León had one of the first jazz bands. It was literally called the Los Sultanes del Jazz, because one of the code terms or slogans of Monterrey, Nuevo León is La Sultana del Norte, right? The Sultan of the North, in that respect. Now here you had this jazz band, the Sultanes the Sultanes de Jazz of Monterrey, Nuevo León, playing jazz in 1914 in Monterrey. Is that Mexican music? And if we're going to have Mexican music, who's going to compose it? This is a period of time of of movies, film. Think about it. Birth of a Nation, 1915. Were those ideas in Birth of a Nation consistent with the Mexican Revolution? I think not. And yet, it is estimated that at least 2/3 of the American population had seen Birth of a Nation by 1920. By 1920, roughly 2/3 of Americans went to see a movie at least once a week. Once a week. Imagine it. Incredible power. But for the Mexican government, then what kinds of images to put on those screens that are consistent with the ideals of the revolution? Another aspect of mass entertainment is a tremendous increase in the rate of urbanization of Mexico as a consequence of the revolution. The violence and so on pushed many people to go into cities because so much of the violence was taking place in the countryside. So you have all of these people going to Guadalajara, Monterrey, Veracruz, Puebla, and especially, of course, Mexico City. And what do they find when they get there? Now, I come from a very small town in the San Joaquin Valley. It's the only county in California that lost population between 1960 and 1970. And that movie with Bruce Willis, where he ends up being dead, right? The famous line, "I see dead people," all right? That's my hometown. When I go home, I see dead people, all right? It's a dying little town in the San Joaquin Valley. And those of you who ever have gone up and down Highway 99, you know that a lot of those little towns are basically turning into ghost towns in that respect. Right? That's what was taking place in the countryside in Mexico, with so many villages and small communities, where many of the men had been drafted, many of the men had been killed, many of the men had been maimed and injured and unable to continue to work, and so forth and so on. In that sense, then Mexico changed socially and culturally in a very short period of time, while Mexico is trying to digest things like radio, things like musical recordings, things like film, and so forth and so on, right? Leading to this effervescence of urban culture and so on. So how to incorporate this new urban culture in the midst of a revolution that is making the countryside, the campesino, the rural proletariat, the icon of the revolution itself. How to reconcile those two views, in a manner of speaking, was another challenge for this new order. Unfortunately, the winners of the Mexican Revolution were, in many respects, the most conservative faction of the revolution. Sabata was dead by 1919. Carranza was dead by 1920, the president who was in office when the Constitution of 1917 was signed. Pancho Villa would be dead by 1923. Pascual Orozco had died very early on. Madero was assassinated, in part due to a plot organized by the U.S. ambassador at that time in Mexico in 1911, Henry Lane Wilson. So the faction that came out of the revolution, that was responsible, essentially, for the death of Sabata, that was probably the group that were the intellectual authors of the assassination of Villa, the people who had killed off Carranza and so on, those were the winners of the Mexican Revolution, turning the revolution in a very different direction. In our own country, right? The ideals of our founding fathers, as we like to say, were not always carried out in that respect. And I'll just stop there, since we know that story only too well. The important point is that Rivera and his counterparts then had to negotiate, had to think about all of these currents that are taking place in this period of time, which makes then Lázaro Cárdenas, who becomes president in 1934, undoubtedly the greatest figure of the 20th century in Mexican history. Because it would be Cárdenas who would make a almost last-ditch effort to redeem the promises of the revolution. Between 1920 and 1934, 7.7 million hectares of land was distributed by the Mexican government in response to not only the ideal of agrarian reform, but more likely because of political pressures in the countryside. Because too many peasants had learned how to use guns and rifles. And it was a power that any government could not dismiss in that respect. So concessions were made, including the distribution of 7.5 million or so hectares of land. Here comes Cárdenas, who in about 5 years distributed nearly 20 million hectares of land. Totally changing the whole discussion of what it meant to be Mexican in that respect, especially when it comes to the relationship with land. It would be Cárdenas who would pass laws that Mexican music had to be played on Mexican radio stations at least 50% of the time. And if you don't like it, the government will take your radio license. It was Cárdenas who established a financial institution for the making of Mexican movies, El Banco Cinematográfico. And he said, make Mexican movies. Which immediately raised the question, well, if we're going to make Mexican movies, then what do Mexicans look like, in a manner of speaking? And what songs are they going to sing? What kind of music are they going to play? And so on, in those films and the like. It was Cárdenas who said, Mexican dance should be performed in public and in schools. And Mexican dance should evoke the ideals of the people of Mexico and so on. And those of you who have high school dance group, folklorico groups and so on, the repertoire of those groups goes back to the 1930s, if you will. The mariachi becomes the national musical symbol, largely due to what happens in the late 1930s. Because Cárdenas goes to the radio stations and said, "Dadgummit," and I don't think he said dadgummit, but you will play Mexican music, and this is what we mean by Mexican, and this is how you're supposed to dress if you're a Mexican musician, and so forth and so on, and everybody starts wearing big hats and so on. No Mexican movie is made in the 1940s without mariachis and their big hats and their charro outfits and so forth. Now, nobody dressed that way in Mexico prior to that, but that became the iconic way of understanding. Carlos Chavez creates one of his most beautiful symphonies that tries to incorporate all these different elements that he thought would, in a sense, generate or suggest what Mexican music. Nancy Compapello is is choreographing dances and so on, trying to fuse ballet with notions of Mexican folkloric music and the like. And archaeologists are going throughout Mexico and so on, recovering, discovering, if you will, Mexico's indigenous past, and so forth and so on. Right? So Cárdenas, in a variety of different ways, not to mention the nationalization of the oil industry in 1938. And if I had the time, I'd show you the footage of people going to the Zócalo in Mexico City with their chickens, with their pigs, and so on, to give to the Mexican government, to pay off the foreign oil interests for their demands for being indemnified for the loss of their property and so on. Women taking off their earrings, their little copper wedding rings and so on. Children taking their little animals and so forth and so on. It's amazing. This incredible show of not only love of country, but nationalism in this period of time. Scared the holy bejesus of the foreign observers who were there in 1938, if you will. And not to mention the fact that Cárdenas reanimates Article 123 and its labor provisions and so on, basically taking on the most powerful business group at that time in Mexico, in Monterrey, Nuevo León. And he goes in February of 1936 and literally gets in the face of these incredible, powerful businessmen, kind of like the Rockefellers and Leland Stanfords and Huntingtons and Crockers and so on of their time, and literally almost, in a sense, getting them by the shirt and saying, "God damn it, you will back off. You will allow organizing in your factories and so on, or I will confiscate your ass." And that was no empty trick, because he had just done that a few months earlier by taking thousands of acres from rich landowners in what is known as the Laguna District in north central Mexico. So this was no empty threat. And the businessmen of Monterrey, quote unquote, backed off. They blinked, in a manner of speaking. And next door was Franklin Delano Roosevelt saying, "Oh shit." So when the American oil interests came to Roosevelt and said, "You got to take back, you got to send in the troops, you got to take back our oil drills and so on," Roosevelt said, "I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to do this. In fact, I'm going to change my tune. We're going to call it the good neighbor policy. All right? We're going to sing with Mexico, all right, as opposed to yell at it and so on." And all during this time, these artists were absorbing all of these events that's taking place. In that sense, it is an incredibly effervescent time. This kind of foam, in a sense, constantly rising to the top. This turmoil, these roily waters, whatever metaphor you want to use, takes place in this period of time. Unfortunately, Cárdenas in 1940 steps down, and things change. In 1947, Daniel Cosío Villegas, one of the leading intellectuals and historians of his time, makes one of the first and perhaps most important critiques of what had happened between 1940 and 1946, criticizing Cárdenas' successors for basically betraying the promises of the revolution, betraying the political capital that Cardenas had given to his successor in 1940. In 1953, José Luis Cuevas, using the Berlin Wall as a kind of metaphor, writes his famous essay, La Cortina de Nopal, the cactus curtain, basically criticizing how Mexican art had lost its way, had become cliché, had become standardized, was no longer revolutionary, had become stuck in a rut, stuck in paintings after paintings of beautiful countryside, beautiful peasants, beautiful peasant girls, beautiful pyramids, beautiful Aztec warriors, and so on. And yet, much of that painting had become empty, hollow of the original thrust, that original revolutionary thrust of the artist at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. Thank you very much. I talked a little bit of Q&A because I become a teacher again. I taught in migrant ed, and I used to love the little Mexican kids who kind of hang on to your pants and say, teacher. All right, so, question.
In 1917, Mexico, at least in theory, got big government and a focus on Main Street. And we didn't really get it here until 33 with FDR. But obviously there's some like interplay, ricocheting, if you will, if you understand. Could you develop that a little bit, this relationship between that idea of big government, Main Street, and then, what really didn't develop here until later, or in a relationship between the two?
Sure. Several ideas came together among intellectuals that were responsible for the writing of the actual Constitution and put it together. One of those ideas came from what we call fascism, and fascist ideas that the government basically is responsible for making sure the trains run on time were already circulating in this period of time. Keep in mind, socialist ideas had been circulating since the middle of the 19th century. So in that sense, the role of big government was not an idea that was anything new at that time. What was very much in the minds of Mexican intellectuals were three very difficult economic moments in their lifetimes. One was a very long recession of the early 1890s. In this country, it's 1893 to 1897. But for the Latin American countries who depended on exports, like bananas, right, that recession was devastating in terms of its impact on the Mexican economy. Next came one of the key sources, in many respects, of the rise of rebellions and revolts by workers and so on, and that would be recession of 1907, which in the case of Mexico, it never recovered from in that respect. It was, in a sense, the preamble, if you will, for what happens in 1910, but the strikes of 1907, 1908, 1909, and so on in Mexico had a tremendous intellectual impact on Mexican thinkers at that time, intellectuals and so on. And then finally, with the start of World War I, what did that do to a Mexican economy that was obviously very dependent on exports and so on? So in that sense, the series of events not only made capitalism suspect, but it also made for Mexicans the importance that they had to control, they had to manage their economic destiny rather than depending on foreigners and so on to essentially be responsible for the prosperity or lack thereof of their own national economy. Yes?
Can you comment on the influence, if any, of painters, poets, photographers, other artists from the United States who went to Mexico in this period of time, from the early 20s all the way through? And certainly we know that Mexico had huge influence on them and their work, but do you think there was influence that was then left by the artists from the United States who spent a lot of time?
Sure, because a lot of American artists had to wrestle, particularly with the artistic consequences of World War I. And in that sense, the search for new forms of cultural expression that came out of the intellectual bankruptcy, if you will, moral and cultural, as well, of Europe the aftermath of World War I meant that photographers and painters and so on from the United States came down to Mexico in part to be inspired or to find inspiration in what was taking place in Mexico, what they thought was taking place in Mexico in that sense. Everybody from Langston Hughes to D.H. Lawrence, Weston and others, not to mention Tina Modotti, who will be the subject of a talk later today, and so on. So there was a great deal of interaction, and there's a whole book written by Helen Delpar, the author of the essay in the book here, called When Mexico Was in Vogue. And she's basically talking about Americans and their love affair, if you will, their romance with revolutionary Mexico, not to mention the romance of intellectuals from Latin America and from Europe and so on. So yes, and that influence, if you will, was part of that debate, was part of that discussion that took place in coffee houses and bars and so forth over how to incorporate those elements coming from the United States in the midst of trying to codify, trying to define this amorphous thing called Mexicanidad. Yes?
I'm a little bit discomforted by the degree to which you seem to invoke a great man theory of history with regard to Cárdenas, both in how you say that before he arrived that the right wing of the revolution, as it were, had won, and that he was then trying to redeem, and that he was able to accomplish so much for a while. I mean, what about it seems to me there must be a big chunk of explanation about why the left Obregonistas in general were not stronger, and what role they played both in his momentary strength and in his
60, 30-second response. All during this period of time. I mean, Cárdenas was a politician. He had learned all of the political tricks. Right? He was, in that sense, no innocent, idealistic, if you want, romantic in that regard. He had learned from the political games that were being played going back to the revolution. Keep in mind, he was an officer during the time of the Mexican Revolution. So in this respect, yes, there was all kinds of things going on underneath, and in recognition of those issues, those questions, those problems, that frustration, that discontent, that dissatisfaction, all right, led to most, if not all, of Cárdenas's program. He knew that workers were really ticked off. He knew that in the countryside it was seething with discontent, following when Calles, his predecessor in office, basically said, we're not going to do agrarian reform anymore. When Calles basically sold his soul and other things to Dwight Morrow, the Wall Street banker, etc., etc., he was very much aware of the corruption in the labor movement, etc. I mean, yes, all those things were taking place that led to Cárdenas taking those political calculations and acting on them, if you will. Now, he could have acted in a very different way because he was put into office by Calles as a puppet of that order that had been corrupt and so forth and so on. And they thought that they were going to put this reformist face on the Mexican government, given his track record as governor of Michoacán, and in a sense tried to rationalize the turn to the right that had taken place within Mexico and so on. So this is not about a great man. This is about a very savvy, canny politician understanding what was taking place in Mexico at that time. It so happened that it coincided with his own views as to what had happened and so on. Right? But you know, there's a lot of drama there that unfortunately I can't talk about because Cárdenas, in this respect, knew all of the political players, and he lined up those that were on his side and those that were against him. And the people that were against him called Calles, who was in Los Angeles getting treatments for his very bad case of hemorrhoids. And he gets on a plane, goes to Mexico City, and basically tells his buds there, I'm going to put him in his place, I will have him back off, and so forth and so on. And in the middle of the night, a couple of weeks later, a group of soldiers go into his bedroom and said, Mr. Calles, you either go with us or you're dead. And Calles gets on the phone, calls his buds, and none of them answered his phone call in a manner of speaking. So he gets on the plane, comes back and says, I was ousted, there's no justification for this, and there's not a peep from Mexico. Kind of reminds you of that great scene in The Godfather, right? Where they're at the church and all his enemies are being offed. That's what Cardenas did. So he was, I'm not suggesting the great man theory and so on. I'm suggesting that he could have acted in a very different kind of way, and certainly he was expected to, but he didn't. Rather than suppressing labor, he did the opposite. Rather than making concessions, he opened the doors, etc., etc. So, but unfortunately, lack of time, I can't talk about what's going on at the bottom. I would never subscribe to a great man theory of history in that respect. At least not me. I don't believe in that. Yes?
Your critique of Sabata being somewhat reactionary.
The critique by socialists, communists, and so on that period of time. Okay. I have my own views about Sabata.
Oh, all right. Because I was going to say, you've not...
But now that you mention it...
pedestal, and I had put him on. I mean,
right.
I had perceived him as, the one authentic revolutionary of the Mexican Revolution. And, I mean, I can understand the socialist critique, but given the actual situation where, 90-some% of the people were in small towns or campesinos, what else would you have expected? What else should we have expected from him other than, his
from
concern
him,
about
Zapata?
agrarian reform?
You mean from Zapata?
Zapata.
Well, Zapata was a figure that reflected that period of time. I mean, this was happening all over the world as a capitalist industrial onslaught on rural populations, rural communities, and the like. And in Mexico, what this meant over a very short period of time is that something like 80% of the peasantry was landless by this time. There was a tremendous confiscation of indigenous lands by capitalist interests, both foreign and domestic, and the like. And Zapata was successful in part because he survived. There was a series of agrarian rebellions all during the latter part of the 19th century, all over Mexico. He was one of the few that lived long enough to put up a level of resistance that was, for that time, unprecedented in this respect. And in that sense, Zapata is unique in many respects because his movement was able to reach a level of organization and so on that previous rebellions had not been able to achieve. The other part we need to understand is that Zapata was essentially interested in his area, in his region, and this sort of thing, which is the state of Morelos, or the area in which he lived in Morelos, and so on. He was not involved in a great effort to organize campesinos in the Yucatan, in Chiapas, in Oaxaca, and so on. In that sense, he was a regional leader in that regard. Zapata himself, as an individual, had no national vision other than a very amorphous idea that the people who work the land should own it. But that's about as far as it went. And in that respect, in 1915, among his close advisors, Antonio Soto y Gama comes up with an agrarian code that will later be incorporated into the Constitution and so on. But those were not his words. They were his ideas, perhaps. But in terms of codifying that, it would be people like Antonio Soto y Gama, Luis Montaño, and so on, who gave words, in a sense, to Zapata's ideas and so on, in that respect. Now, whether that should have been the basis of the revolution and so on, it's one of those what ifs. One of those what ifs. What if Trotsky and his faction would have won over in the Bolshevik Revolution? I don't know what would have happened. In the case of Zapata, he was surrounded by advisors. I suspect Zapata would not have accepted the presidency of Mexico. He had his chance in that famous picture where he's sitting next to Villa, and Villa says, "You sit down," and Zapata says, "No, you sit there in the presidential chair." That's not what I'm about, if I can use the vernacular in that respect. I think Sabata would have been a revolutionary all of his life, fighting for the rights of those people that he felt had been oppressed, particularly peasants, small landholders, and the like. He would have been a pain in the ass for anybody who would have taken power. And that's why they killed him. I have to go to class.
Okay, goodbye.
We have 15 more minutes.
Okay.
But he has to go to class.
But I
Oh, you have
have,
to go to class.
yeah, and I
Yes,
couldn't
good
reach
job.
my graduate student to let her know, but
let me
okay.
tell you
It's
I'll-
okay, it's okay.
No, it's all right.
Well, I'm more interested in the issues of the reification of popular culture.
Mhm.
And you were saying that in 38, governments sort of solidified these like icons of popular culture. When did you put it back a little further? I mean,
No, I solidified, all right. The process starts much earlier.
so he's the one that makes it so that...
He's the one that institutionalizes. Now, I'll give you two examples. Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, INA, all right?
Right.
Huge bureaucracy now.
Exactly.
But he gives INA in 1938 the purview, right, to organize all of these programs, initiatives, and so on that in some cases go all the way back to the 1919, 1920, 1921, and so on. So he creates this institutional framework
Okay.
for
Okay.
all of these programs and initiatives to, in a sense, come under one wing, if you will. SEP, Secretaría de Educación Pública, the educational ministry, had been in charge during Vasconcelos and so on of creating all these different programs, but they went in all different directions in a manner of speaking. Vasconcelos never really, in a sense, organized them into what you and I would say a bureaucracy
Right.
with
Oh,
a
okay.
clear top-down, if you want, orientation and so on. And Cárdenas does that. The other one is Instituto Nacional Indigenista. This is the
Exactly.
National Indigenous Institute and so on, which again codifies and organizes a lot of initiatives that go back to the period right after the revolution, if you
Right.
will.
Because in the painting of Rivera, there's a real presence of what we do with our indigenous blood. I mean, the people that are not peninsulares or the children of those people
Right.
who are not pure-blooded people, and the sort of reification of Indians in murals.
Yeah, and that, you know, I wish I had the time, but you had two fundamental contrasting views and so on. One was, which was Manuel Gamio in 1914, his classic work called Forjando Patria. And he says, Mexico is fundamentally Indian. That's our heritage, that's our culture, and so on, which resonates into the present with Guillermo Bonfil Batalla's book, México Profundo, all right? But there was then the notion of mestizaje, all right? We're a people that fuses various cultures together. But in the context of what had happened in the 19th century, where the indigenous culture was basically disparaged, denigrated, and the like, then the people who believed in mestizaje, the elevation, if you will, and recognition of the European basis of Mexicanidad and so on, they didn't need any more attention, if you will. That had been going on for a long time. What was required then was the elevation of the indigenous dimension of mestizaje to make it equal to, and in the eyes of some people, better than the European and so on. Later they added the African aspect and so forth and so on. But the important point here is that indigenismo was not necessarily the same thing as a notion of mestizaje, but because the concept of mestizaje meant that there was equality between the European and the indigenous and so on. It was the indigenous that needed to be, in a sense, elevated in significance, importance, and so on, since the European aspect had always been the basis of notions of being Mexican and the like.
Okay, great.
Any other questions? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to realize
Well, I thought I couldn't, in fact, I almost had my cell phone on to see if she got my message. I had 4 messages. Don't forget. Remember Cobwebs, long weekend? Don't forget I'm not going to be there for about 10 minutes, 20 minutes or so. So I hope the class has allowed. Any other questions? I didn't mean to cut off discussion. I will answer pressing questions on the assumption that my graduate student got the word. Okay, I know you're a good dancer. Yes.
And this is aerodynamics.
Okay.
Physics part. Mexican Americans in this country in the last century as a result of the fact this big infusion of Mexicans without a legacy of education in their family history.
Okay. Well, look, the average year of schooling in Mexico at this point in time is just over 9 years. That's the average. Mexican immigrants come close to that average. But the issue is not how many years you've gone to school, but the quality of that schooling. Do I need to say that to an American audience, not to mention the California audience? So, for the first time in the history of Mexican public education, in 2000, I think it was 2004, it might have been 2005, and in 2008, Mexican children in the 5th grade were given what you and I would call a standardized test, all right? And they scored abysmally. Why? Because public education was neglected for decades in Mexico, because the elite of Mexico could care less about Mexico's rural population. So the quality of rural public education in Mexico was much worse than was the case in the cities and so on. And it's horrible. I mean, Education Week had a wonderful expose on Mexican education. I think it was published in 2000. I want to say 2005, 2006. And they did an extensive study and so on. They have schools, for example, this is in Oaxaca, by the way, where the rich kids go to school in the morning, and the games and the balls and all that kind of stuff is available to them in the morning. In the afternoon, the poor kids who go to the school, because they have to have 2 sessions because they don't have enough schools for the population and so on, they put away the balls, they put away the games and this sort of thing, because you know how the poor Mexican kids are. You know, they break them, they take them home and so forth and so on. Well, guess what state this new influx of Mexicans come from to a large extent, especially in California. They come from Oaxaca, all right, etc. So in that sense, the quality of public education in Mexico had been abysmal for decades. And the parents in that respect reflect that in terms of their own schooling, if you will. School is about getting a job, a better job. And my dad was that way. When I graduated from high school, he expected me to go to work, sort of thing. And when I told him I wanted to go to college, he literally put his hand across his chest and said to me in Spanish, "Tú no quieres trabajar. You just don't want to work," sort of thing. And I told him I'm going to work, bring home money, and go to school at the same time. That's the only way that he accepted the decision. In that sense, the big arc of the influx of Mexican immigration, which started in the middle 60s and so on, has dissipated. By the next census, the majority of Mexicans in this country will be native born. That is, they will be the children of immigrants. So that long history of the last 30 years or so, where you saw this increasing tide of Mexican immigration, has flattened out. And part of it has to do with demography. The Mexican population is finally getting older. For a long time, the majority of the Mexican population was, as demographers say, of childbearing age. Well, that's ending. And despite the desire of Mexican parents and so on, more or less the body says no more kids at around age 40, with Mexican men around age 60, right, sort of thing. And more Mexican men are getting to that age where they either can't have children or don't want children. They have enough with their grandchildren, in a manner of speaking. Right? In that sense, demographically, then, among the reasons why Mexicans came was the shortage of jobs relative to the entry of people into the labor force. That era is slowly dwindling, and this current recession in this country has accelerated that decline, because people come here to work, there are no jobs, so why come? And the biggest impact right now on the decline of illegal immigration is our current recession, which is not a good solution to the illegal problem. Let's have a long recession and they'll stop coming. I personally don't want that solution, if you will. One last burning question by anyone? Okay, one last. Toward a new raw deal. Okay. No, okay.
Do you think FDR's labor policies, since they came earlier, enabled Cardenas to do what he did?
No. Cardenas was responding to a lot of workers being really pissed off. and he had a labor leader who was willing to take on the corrupt labor system that had developed going back to the late 1920s with this kind of corrupt labor leader by the name of Luis Morones. And Vicente Lombardo Toledano became both a source of political power for Cárdenas, but in exchange, by mobilizing this new labor movement within Mexico and so on, Lombardo Toledano said, okay, it's payback, right? I supported you politically and so on. The old corrupt labor unions and so on supported the right-wingers in a sense. If you want my support and that of my legions of workers and so on, you got to pay me back. And Cárdenas did. It became known as the CTM, Federación de Trabajadores Mexicanos. Thank you so much.